T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
Welcome to this awesome episode of AWS Made Easy. I'm so glad to be here with Jeff Barr, Chief Evangelist of AWS, and much more importantly, my dad, and co-host Raul Subramaniam. And we're here in, can I call this HQ0?
Definitely HQ0.
Okay,
I like that.
HQ0. We're in HQ0, your home office, and we want to talk about Amazon, about AWS, about 3D printing. If you hear the buzzing behind, that's a Prusa XL. I think we want to keep the mechanical noises as part of the soundtrack. So, yeah,
You'll have to get some B-roll of the XL, though.
Yo, yeah,
We
definitely.
will.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much for having us here, Jeff.
For
This
sure.
has been,
You know, when I conceived of this space, I wanted to make it not just a place to work, but a place I was really happy to actually show up every day, and that when guests come in, they're like, wow, this is actually a pretty cool, inviting space. And so being able to have it and share it and use it was absolutely the intent. That's why we've got good colors and plenty of space, hopefully plenty of power, although whenever you provision power, you're like, I should have gotten twice as many.
It's never
like
enough.
that. So,
Well, even all this gear, right? I could count. I think I used 10 outlets on all this stuff, just with the amplifier, the DAC, the cameras, the light. So yeah, it's
well, that wall back
easy to
there, I
quickly.
said, okay, when they came in to lay out the power, I said, I want 4 outlets every couple feet. And they're like, that's way too much. And I should have done twice as many, and it would have been just fine.
Yeah.
And I should have put more underneath, but
No, I mean, this is a properly function, not just a home office, but it's a maker space of sorts.
it's a
You're
total
right.
makerspace. And
You-
the thing I'm really liking is that there's a lot of kind of functional concurrency in here where
Right.
I can be doing my job, and that's what takes up most of my time. But
Right.
a lot of my hobbies are basically somehow asynchronous. And
Yeah.
so spinning up a new print on either of the printers or going outside a little bit and checking the garden, those
Yeah.
things kind of happen without continuous involvement. But because I'm working from here, I can check on progress and I can make sure that
Correct.
everything is moving ahead as I
No, it's the
like.
perfect
So-
balance. That's what you'd want out of any workspace.
I think so.
Yeah.
And always being happy to walk in and say, wow, I love the colors, I love the lights, I love the fact that it is an enclosed space and I've
Yeah.
got control, and but I'm still connected to the house and to the family, so I really like
True.
it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and also another important thing I've realized is with grandkids coming in, it not only is it welcoming, but I try really hard to keep it safe. It's a little bit of a mess right now because we're setting up,
Right.
but I don't leave tools ever laying around. I try to, not just for safety, but to set a really good example of saying, okay, a good workspace should be really nicely organized, and there's a place for everything. One of those drawers behind you, I've got all my, the top one on the right there,
This one?
yeah, has got all of my like pliers, and they're carefully aligned in shadow foam. One of my
nice.
friends looked and said, "Wow, this looks like serial killer level of organization." but actually, putting
But it
energy
helps.
into organizing your space is well worth it. So that
I
you know
completely
where
agree.
everything is, and that it's actually that everything is there.
It actually also motivates you to come in and do something, right? I mean, if everything is in a clutter, you don't even want to go near there after some time.
Oh, for sure.
And so it kind of motivates you to go there and do something interesting
Yeah.
to make a space. So
and
I
that
completely
little bit of
agree.
discipline of keeping things organized and clean is so worth it.
Yeah, I
Organized,
agree.
clean, fanatically well labeled. Yes, it's a tiny bit obsessive, but in a worthwhile way. That you,
I couldn't agree more.
I'm trying. But I struggle with it. You saw the office at its peak, right? But there's just so much entropy and chaos in it that I always have to fight it.
but whenever I have like little bins with stuff in them, I always print 2 labels. So regardless of which end I take of the bin and put it back in,
Right.
I know what's inside the bin.
That's,
5 more seconds, and I save milliseconds over the course of a year by doing that. But it's worth it.
Could be
you
a
know,
whole
just that-
second in there.
Yeah, it could maybe over my
It adds
lifetime.
up.
It's but why not? You know,
Yeah.
just those little things I think make it really worthwhile. And then
Yeah.
like so, some of my 3D printing I print on fabric, and to
Right.
cut the fabric I have to use an actual medical grade scalpel. The scalpel is not within reach even for me. It's way up there. When I need a piece of fabric, in my head I very kind of explicitly, okay, lay out the fabric, fasten it down, get the scalpel, use the scalpel, put the scalpel
back.
back. there are no intermediate states where I leave it laying around. Like
So you
it's
don't
almost
just set it down for a moment and go make lunch and all of a sudden
no,
it's out.
it's almost a transaction because I could hurt myself or someone else could get hurt. And I want to make sure that any grandkid that's old enough to walk in here by themselves is going to say, wow, this is, first, it's a really cool space and there's always some activity, but I don't want them to find something and hurt themselves in some way.
Yeah,
so
we have to get some B-roll of the entire place. There's tons of Lego, 3D printing, and all this other stuff. Again, it's inspirational. I try to be as organized as I possibly can, but I'm taking away lots of lessons.
I think
about
part
what
of all
to
these
do.
hobbies is just the organizational part of just saying, do I have all the right things? And to be familiar with the fact that you have them. And kind of like, I saw some video the other day where someone said they go through all their cabinets and drawers every 6 months just to refresh themselves of what they have, which is
I think I pretty much do the same. So
That's
it's
a good idea.
Yeah, and just reorganizing everything really helps you get rid of stuff that you know that you're not going to use for a while.
Well,
But
we
other
don't have
stuff
the
is
word
just better organized.
defragmenting anymore, right? But that's what you're doing, right?
Oh, yeah,
You're
the
like,
defragmenting
I
is
defrag all the time. I actually defrag my calendar sometimes, where I have a lot of different kinds of meetings and things.
well, it's not for hard disks, right? It's not the.
Oh, but I defrag the calendar. I try to push all the meetings to one day, and if there's little gaps, I'll check in and see if I can make somebody's day a little bit better by optimizing all the meetings together. And I'd rather have one block of meetings that fills up the whole day than a whole week that's just kind of checkerboarded with meetings. In fact, what we do now is I try to get all of my calls and my mentoring. We do all that on Thursdays. And so Thursdays is the day that is the externally visible day, and then the others are mostly content creation and more quiet time.
Well, we'll have to talk about it later. We tried to do a Bedrock agent, which could move things in the calendar. It's tricky to get it right. We're getting there.
Some tools just find AWS cost savings and make you do all the work. Visualizing cost opportunities is great, but that's not enough. CloudFix, on the other hand, actually delivers those savings for you. And you don't need to worry because CloudFix uses AWS recommended savings techniques. It fixes, not just finds. It's the easiest way to save money on AWS. It's 100% automatic and risk-free. And the best part of all, it works non-stop. Stop overspending on AWS and click on the link to start saving now.
Great. So, a bunch of different topics that we wanted to cover today. We're going to talk a little bit about the 3D printing and all of that stuff. But first, given that AI is now just literally all over the place, wanted to dive a little bit about how you and your team and your org are actually leveraging this. So, two areas where I've been fascinated and you're always looking to learn from you. One is how you learn so fast. How do you learn all the stuff that's coming? You're literally at the cusp of that entire fire hose of all the information that's coming through AWS teams out into the world. So how do you and your team kind of grapple with all that information that's coming in, grasp it, and then write about it? Because I think the one skill that I really aspire to kind of learn from you on is how you articulate your learning and grasp and make it as simple as possible for someone to consume it. But that's a skill. That's a real skill. And I've been fascinated by how you do it. So I'd love to learn more about those two aspects of it. How do you learn? And then we'll talk about how you write.
Wow. Okay, so in my job, you get imposter syndrome big time because there's this big misunderstanding that I somehow understand everything about every AWS service that has ever been launched. Nothing could be further from the truth. I actually get Slacks regularly that someone will send me a link to a blog post from 10 plus years ago and say, Jeff, I was just reading your post and I have this very detailed question about this one particular aspect of the service and how would you go about approaching this in this very complex use case? And I always say, well, I'm really impressed that I've actually fooled you to thinking I know all this about these, but let me actually track down a legitimate expert on this particular topic. And so a lot more of what we get to do in developer advocacy, I think, is learning very quickly. And but you often just dive deep into a topic for the space of a couple hours. You immerse yourself in it, you learn really quickly. But I find that a lot of what I'm actually doing is, it's not quite learning as much as organizing information. So my process for writing a blog post is we start with an Amazon document that's called the PRFAQ, the press release plus the FAQ.
Got it.
I take that and I I read it through once, and I'll often highlight, and then I'll go through and I'll open up a mind mapping tool. I'll create a mind map that basically represents all the information in the PR FAQ and plus whatever other little bits of messaging that they might have sent me.
Got it.
At that point, I have basically a structured representation of all the information. And I think of the mind map as first organizing, but second, giving me this bird's eye view where everything is at the same level. And even if the team said, well, here's our launch and here's the part we thought was the most important,
right,
I will reserve my judgment on that, and I will. They trust me enough that I can say, well, I can tell that you've emphasized this because you put way too much of your own energy into this compared to the other features.
Got it.
So the mind map levels the playing field, and I can step back a bit and say, okay, here's all the features, here's all the things. Let me make a choice of what I would like to write about. And so once I have the mind map and I've used the service, writing the blog post is basically like it's like an in-order traversal of the tree of the mind map. So I'm just kind of walking through the whole thing node by node by node, making decisions of, do I think the audience cares enough about this to include it? And if so, how much should I say about this? And so there's the what to leave in, what to leave out decisions.
Got it.
At the point as I'm writing the post and I'm deeply walking through the mind map, I probably know a whole bunch about the service. A week or two later, I'm moved on to something else. And it's just flown down the river. So I don't tend to retain all these details over an extended period
let's
of time.
dive a little bit into the mind map part of it, because that's fascinating as well. There's a lot of technical stuff that goes into mind map. That I've traditionally seen mind maps being used in, let's say you're drafting out a story or you're trying to tell a story. There are different aspects of the storytelling that kind of they fit very well into a mind map like scenario. When it comes to a technical release of a product feature, right? What would be an example of a mind map, like how the way you'd organize it?
So generally what I'll try to do is I'll start with there'll be a node that's the introduction, and it'll be what do I want to do as the on-ramp to the blog post.
Got it.
But then there'll be a lot that is there'll be things like use cases and features, important safety tips, but I don't necessarily mirror the ultimate blog post in the mind map. It's more, because of the way we write the PR FAQs, especially the FAQ part, the relevant pieces of information are not necessarily grouped together. And that's not a plus or minus, it's just the way that the questions accumulate and we never renumber them. So question 3 and question 33 might have information about the same topic. So the mind map is kind of sorting all that into a nice clean structure. Now, a mind map and an outline are actually structurally the same, but outlines are they're documentation-y, they're kind of boring, they go on for pages. The mind map looks cool, which is, again, that visual appeal of do I want to go into this nice kind of branching structure because it looks neat? You can have it automatically color code, but also what's the right word for it? It fills the space, so it doesn't get longer and longer. It just gets more dense and spread out. So everything always fits on the same page, regardless of how much information is there. I sometimes wonder if, because everything that I'm putting into the mind map is effectively public info, I could actually just publish that instead of the blog post. If someone wanted all the details, I could say, well, here's the mind map, and this is the unique way that my brain happens to organize all the information.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating to see one of those.
Is that interesting?
Yeah, that'd be definitely fascinating to see.
The thing is, there's always more information to share than we have room to share, because we don't do multi-thousand word blog posts on my team. We try to keep them well under 1,000. We kind of really focus in on just the specifics. And so making very careful decisions of what to include, what not to include. We're not writing a review that has to cover every last possible feature. And that's something we have to remind the teams of all the time.
And how do you balance setting the stage, given the context of who should care about this feature? Because for certain features, I don't know, maybe a new type of metal instance, right, where there's 95% of people don't care, but those 5% that do really care. How do you balance? Okay, this is a general consumption versus this only matters for you if you use SAP HANA or something.
So part of that is the title, and titles I think are one of the more challenging parts of a good blog post. We continuously get input from the SEO side of our organization, some of which seems really helpful. The rest seems like it's kind of magic in some way that I'm not sure I always actually understand what they're trying to accomplish. Sometimes, and some days it's like, well, capital letters mean less than lowercase letters or vice versa, and start with a verb or a noun. I'm not always sure that actually works, but I spend a lot of energy on the title in the first paragraph. I find that once the title is good and once the first paragraph is good, the rest of it is just that nice clean walk through the mind map. And so I tend to be very linear as a writer. Like, I will not proceed to the first paragraph until I'm very happy with the title. And there might have been 2 or 3 or 4 that I typed, said, no, I don't like that, delete it, put another one.
Got it.
And only when that's good will I write the first paragraph, and only when I'm happy with that intro paragraph will I go linearly through the next. So kind of old school, like literally old school of like, that's how I would write back when I was using a typewriter in middle school or high school to write. So when copying and pasting was impossible, and even just deleting was really hard.
So back to the mind map. Do you do any pruning during creation of that mind map, or do you just put everything in there and then do you make decisions about what to put into the mind map?
Very, very few. I try just to put everything in there that I think might be useful.
Got it.
Because I'm just going through the PR FAQ and putting things into the mind map, it's hard to know what might be important or not important. And part of, occasionally you'll go through most of a launch and occasionally you'll miss the point. It's like,
got it.
You thought it was about this, but it's like, well, this is actually what we're launching. And that itself says something about the whole process, that you can make sure that you're not missing the point by going through and leveling out all the different features and making sure. And so you're asking, like, how do you set the stage? It is, so I'm at 3,300 and something blog posts right now. It would be awesome if someone has read all of them. I can't actually count on that, so they haven't really actually read and remembered the whole story. So you kind of think of it like a sequel to a movie, where the first paragraph might have to bring you up to speed on where you've been before and what's already been said.
Yeah, but there's also some balancing out, right? Because you can't, when Back to the Future 2 comes out, you can't say, okay, there's a guy with a DeLorean, he can time travel. Now that we're all on the same page, right, you're going to miss something, but it's okay.
Exactly. And, we look back to old posts, and it kind of reminds me of a thing I've always wanted to do, was take all of the blog posts and all the launches and build basically like an evolutionary tree of everything we've ever done. I don't know how to do that without going through and actually creating that tree myself, right? Because you can start with like instance, and then the original M1 small evolved into this, and then it branched off into these other things when we did compute optimized and memory optimized and all the different types and all the generations of like HPC and GPU that we did. It'd be awesome to actually build an actual graph representation.
Yeah, actually you could build a knowledge. So this is a very interesting problem and actually quite doable. So you could actually now take every blog post that you've written, just order them in chronological order, and then start building out your knowledge graph.
Exactly.
With a timeline, and you can use a lot of the semantic. You can use any of the AIs that are now available that'll give you a whole bunch of entities and the semantics around those entities, and you can create those rule sets that you can then use to build out your entire knowledge graph. And then your knowledge graph would be basically built over a period of time. I don't know whether you've seen those. There's a couple of tools for GitHub repositories to see how GitHub repositories have evolved over a period of time.
I think I've seen
some really amazing visualizations for who committed what, when, and how it built up.
It would be fascinating to take a deep service, like take EC2 or EBS or RDS, and to think back how minimal it was, right? It was that minimal lovable product when we launched it 10 or even 15 years ago sometimes.
Yeah.
And look at it now. And like, okay, so RDS, and RDS was just MySQL. And then, we added Oracle and MariaDB and PostgreSQL and SQL Server and
then Aurora and all that stuff
and
came
so
out,
a tree of that would just be really cool just to watch, and just because at any point you can look at the newest part and say, wow, you could have just launched that. But no, you actually had to do all those predecessor steps to know that you had to be to be in a position to do that. It's like you can't do the final one. You have to like almost recap evolution to get to the point where you can do the.
That'd be a very interesting exercise.
Yeah, that would
and I
be
think it'd be
fun.
too hard to do that.
Well, I remember I did it just for the M series EC2, where you have basically 1, 2, 3, 4, but then at 5, you have this Cambrian explosion.
Yeah.
5I, 5As, and the
Yeah,
5
see, it is
Gs.
actually evolution, right?
5Gs.
Like, imagine having that and then have every edge decorated with a little, why did we do this? Was it just because technology moved on? Or this was a customer request? Or this was an invention? That would be a pretty cool piece of structured, processable history to have.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I guess at some point you first just talked about instances, right? There was no such concept as instance size because there was only one.
Yeah.
And obviously the naming structure suggests that they were planning ahead. But was it always called M1.small?
It was actually.
Okay. So they were planning ahead and at some point.
Yeah. But I don't
Two
think
would-
my first blog post mentioned it by name. It was just the instance.
Okay,
And
there's
we were
instance.
pretty shy about names and specs with that first one. I don't think we even used the word regions, or we didn't use regions.
Yeah,
And
there was
we
no
didn't even
concept of a
introduce the
region.
concept of availability zones for a little bit.
There wasn't, I was just telling someone the other day that when I first started using it, there wasn't an IAM. There wasn't the console wasn't quite what you would just have instances and that's it. You just have a list of
Yeah,
instances that
it
you
was
launch.
the command line. There was
Yeah,
command line
correct.
and APIs.
Correct. And so we had to build our own. I remember back then when we first got everyone onto AWS, this was end of 2007, I think. And I had one credit card. And so you could only pay by credit card then. There was no invoicing or anything like that. And we got everyone onto AWS and they all launched their instances. And my credit card limit ran out. And there was no way to kind of get everyone to go, do stuff again. Like you couldn't, because there was no IAM, there was no way. And then everyone had root access because the one credential that you had to be given to everybody. And so scary situation. But so we built our own version of IAM back then, or our own version of a console,
An access control.
an access control
That's a
system
good idea.
where that system would become a proxy to launch instances behind the scene and keep attaching. And that's when we wrote our very first the cost optimization fixer. So we found that everyone, back then machines were still very expensive compared to the data center. If you just let everyone run all these machines all the time. So we would have everyone log in, decide what 8-hour shift that they were working.
Okay.
And whenever they were done, effectively what the EC2 scheduler, instance scheduler is, we built that where it would shut down the machines at their log off time. And that way we saved, 66% on our instance cost pretty much.
So you were originally scratching your own itch when you got into cost optimization.
It had to.
That's amazing.
CloudFix came from that background. Our cloud costs were growing like crazy because we were all in on AWS right from 2008.
Yeah.
And as we were moving more and more
So that
stuff
was even
in,
before the console existed.
before the
Right?
console
And
existed.
We had the Elastic Fox was the
Yes.
the add-in for Firefox. That
Exactly.
was a reasonably good console for a while. There was
Elastic
a lot
Fox
of
actually
good
even
features there.
came later, and that was more for individuals to kind of use. It was great for using S3. Elastic Fox is great as a simple tool to start using S3. EC2 came into Elastic Fox much later, if I remember correctly.
And there was no Boto, right? It was all Perl.
No, there was no Boto. It was direct HTTP requests that we were making back then. I don't even remember using Perl because I wrote the first version of our console in Ruby on Rails, and
I used Perl for Mechanical Turk. That's what it was. Which is still going, right?
yeah,
believe
Mechanical
so.
Turk, I think it's still around.
All right. We need to take a quick break to add some more SD cards into the video. So we will be right back.
Memory limits.
Okay, we're back.
So
We should talk about AI.
yeah,
Oh, you were just.
What-
I think
what-
you were just about to get into that.
yeah. So let's dive right into. Actually, before we dive into AI, let's just talk a little bit about the writing part of it because that's the other part that I'm curious about because you seem to connect really well with the audience, no matter who they are, in terms of simplifying what the capabilities of whatever AWS announcement there is. And not everyone gets it right? We've seen a bunch of blog posts and announcements where we're like scratching our heads trying to figure out what exactly is it and how do we get started with it, how do we use it. But by and large, I think most of what we read from you is very structured. It lets anyone get started with it very quickly. It brings it down to almost everyone's level where it's easy enough to get. So what's your thought process on creating and drafting that? And I know there's tons of practice that's gone into it, 3,000 plus blog posts, but what's what's the mindset behind creating those, and how do you guide your team to write great blog posts like that?
Okay, first, thanks for the compliment. I appreciate that. I sometimes think that I'm really explaining these things to myself. Like, if I don't understand it, there's no chance the audience is going to understand it. And so, as I'm writing, I have to make sure it makes sense to me. And
Got it.
I have a little, like, detector in my head where I'm, like, trying to say, am I lying to myself? Like, am I pretending like I get this and I really don't? And if that detector fires, that's like a Sev 1 alarm. Like, okay, you're just trying to pull the wool over their eyes because you're telling yourself you get it when you actually don't. And I'll just have to stop right there and say, you know what, I don't understand this, and I need to go back and either read some more, or I might have to go to the team and say, I'm really fuzzy on this, I don't quite get it, it doesn't make sense. And sometimes that means I will need to go beyond like the marketing side to say, okay, can I talk to the actual developers? Because the way it's been explained, I'm not getting it, but if you can show me how it works at the code level, maybe that will make a lot more sense to me.
Okay.
So there's that of explaining to myself, but also getting to actually meet readers is super helpful. And then every time you meet a reader and they say exactly what you said, it's been helpful to me and I've understood it, and you're not talking down to me, but you're using the right level of vocabulary, that is just a good reinforcement that says I'm somehow doing it right. And I remember being in Singapore probably 10 plus years ago, and I remember, it's funny, I was there for a summit, and I remember, it's funny how you can kind of like zoom back. Like I was there, I was talking to somebody, and there were these two developers kind of waiting to talk, and they came over and said hi, and I still remember this exact moment. They said, you know, we're two developers, we are from Vietnam, English isn't our first language,
Right.
You're somehow writing this so we understand it, but you're not talking down to us.
Right.
That is like this crystal clear memory in my mind that I'm still writing to keep those two guys happy.
Yeah.
Strangest
It's
thing
amazing
ever,
that you
maybe,
actually
but-
do that, because I struggle with that. Sometimes I forget that I might be a little more technical or a little more used to the AWS ecosystem when I guide someone else about doing something, and then the feedback comes back to me saying, you're just talking over our heads and we don't get what you're talking about. And then I have to remind myself that, okay, I have to go down one level or two levels. So that's one thing that I still need to learn a lot about, how to get down to that level where it's articulated in a manner which is crystal clear to everybody.
You have to reset
no matter
yourself
what.
sometimes. And honestly, sometimes with me, there's total unfamiliarity with the topic. I'm writing something right now, and it needs a directory. And I know nothing about Active Directories or directories, and it's a little hard to get those things set up. And it's like, well, you need the SAML 2.0 thing, and an auth path, and some kind of return path. I honestly have no clue what any of that stuff is, and I need to get a little bit of assistance to get that part figured out. But I won't hand wave past of like, oh, go ask your admin or something. If I don't get it, I'm gonna literally say, I got to this point and I went and asked for some help. And I think you have to be very human when you're writing about this, because if you come across as like, I know everything about everything, they're like, no, that's not believable. But if you say, you know, I got to this point and I got a little bit stuck because it's a little weird or unusual or new to me, everybody can identify with that part of just you're right on that threshold or that frontier of your knowledge, and you want to make sure that you know the audience is too, so you might as well let them identify with we're all in this field where everything is changing all the time.
Got it.
And I think it's better to come across as a lifelong learner versus an impossible know-it-all of all things AWS.
And especially with content creation, right? 'Cause it's so easy because you have the final say in what gets produced, right? It's very easy to edit yourself to say, oh, I'm not going to show the 17 times I tried it and it didn't work. Or I did it wrong, or I failed and I had to take a break. Right? It's easy to just gloss over that part.
Right. Which sometimes they call the happy path, where it's just this like easy glide through all the pieces. And it's good that those exist for all these different services, but it can be challenging if the customer isn't exactly on the path and they want to go a little bit to the sides. It's like you've probably seen those videos where there's a little like walking path cut off the side of the mountain, and there's a steep cliff, or they're like backing a bus around one of those things, and it's like the happy path shouldn't be like that, right? It should have some nice guardrails on it, and it should be relatively like smooth. If you deviate, it should be there's just there's a little bit of a boundary, a margin on the side of the road versus like down that cliff we go.
How do you coach your team to be aware of those red flags? Like, what kind of coaching do you give them?
So at the point, probably close to 10 years ago now, when the blog team grew beyond just me to bring on more writers and a team, I had also been spending a lot of time briefing Amazon customers on our leadership principles. Right. And so I was really deeply immersed in diving deep and frugality and all those great LPs. So one day I just, without a lot of realizing how good this was, I sat down and I kept all the titles of then were the 12 LPs, and I rewrote each of them as a definition of this is how we like to work on the blog team. And so frugality, we're actually being frugal with the audience's time. We're not giving them thousands of words. We're not giving them a 3-part blog post to introduce a simple feature. We're giving them just enough to understand this is what it is, this is what it does, this is a little bit of what I can use it for, this is how to do it, rather than burning up a lot of their time unnecessarily. So mapping the LPs, which at Amazon we all eat, sleep, and breathe all the LPs, keeping all those great titles, and then just saying, this is how we interpret it within the blog team, turned out to be one of those simple things that took a morning that has withstood the test of time for more than I ever
That's actually a really
to.
neat piece of advice. I think that could apply to almost any field, not just, or any domain or any team.
The basic technique I've shared with a bunch of different colleagues, and several teams have done the same thing, where they say, okay, we already know all the titles of these LPs.
Right.
Let's just rewrite the definition to be more specific to our particular needs and to our team. So that's one of the things. The other is that I try really hard to review at least one draft of every post from every one of the writers.
Got it.
The idea isn't, I'm not going to try to get them to write like me, because they each have their own personality and their own voice.
Right.
But to just make sure that their own voice comes through as well as I think it possibly could. So small suggestions of vocabulary occasionally, a couple hints of maybe some more links here. I like to put a lot of links just to make sure that there's lots of avenues to learn more. We have this really awesome team where the team is scattered all around the world, and for most of them, English is not their first language. So we get this great diversity of viewpoints and vocabularies and approaches and writing styles, and I absolutely never say, this is like the standard English way to write stuff. I never, ever, ever would do that. It's like, I just want to make sure that they look good. And that's always my goal. So if they use a word in some interesting way, I'll say, okay, that's not how we would write it. If that works well for you and your system, I'm fine with that. But just I would never want them to look like they don't have full command of their writing. And so that's my goal when I do the very, very light touch of reviews, right? It's never, this is how I did it, so I insist on you doing it that same way. It's let me make sure that you come across as the best writer possible in your terms.
It's a tricky line to walk. Like, even when editing videos, and I'm trying to do subtitles of people, because how people speak isn't how people talk, and then I want to do a subtitle. Do I want to convey exactly what they said, or if they say something that's maybe not grammatically correct in that moment, do I correct their grammar in the subtitles? But yeah, it's a tricky line to walk.
It's a really tricky one, and I always think of it in terms of I want to make sure that they come across well, and I never would want to do anything that would make them feel like they are imperfect or less than
like being corrected or something.
Yeah, sometimes there are folks who may not be grammatically correct or whatever, but they do a brilliant job of coming across, or at least communicating the essence of what they need to get across really well.
So grammatically correct means nothing to me, because I really struggled with writing throughout high school. Like, I was apparently a really, really bad writer to the point where the day before graduation, my high school English teacher actually literally took me aside and said, Jeff, I hear from the other teachers that you are a pretty smart guy. I really can't quite tell that from your writing, but you need to do something about this. And that was a really good wake-up call. And it turned out that the formal way that we were taught English with nouns and verbs and all those parts of speech and syntax diagrams, you would think that as someone who's actually like written compilers and stuff like that, all that would make a lot of sense. None of that makes any sense to me. And when they say, these are the parts of speech and this is how to use them, I still literally don't understand any of that whatsoever. But what worked really well for me was just to read a lot of other fiction and nonfiction writing and say, okay, how is this writer using words? How are they getting their point across? How are they using punctuation? And really learning from examples versus learning from the formal the formal specification, if you will.
Yeah. Like, I mean, there are some authors who have a way of saying, like, you look at PG, you read PG Woodhouse. I wouldn't say that that's grammatically correct, but it's very quirky in the way certain things are said, and it explains those things better than anything else, you know.
I don't know. When I think about this whole idea of grammatically correct, those were just systems imposed on something that was already there. Like the language was almost there first,
Yeah.
and someone said, you know, there's some interesting patterns here. We should like document these patterns.
Right.
But then, especially for a language like English that's borrowed stuff from everywhere else,
Right.
it's like, however,
Yeah.
there's all these exceptions.
True.
So it's trying to explain the intricacies of English to someone who grew up on a language that actually had a better structure to it, and saying, yeah, I know this makes sense, but that's exactly how we don't do it here in this language. It's like, you can't even explain why the rule doesn't apply. It's just that's just the way it goes, and it's pretty embarrassing sometimes.
And it opens up a can of worms.
It
right?
totally does.
Yes, you don't want to go there.
Okay. Shall we dive right into AI?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, would love to understand a little bit more about how you've been looking at AI, leveraging AI, or what you've been doing in your world, because it feels like, one, you're at the center of all the stuff that's happening, and the communication around it kind of falls on your plate. But also, when it comes to writing or learning and, you know, creating all these compositions, AI seems to be the very first thing that everyone quotes as the thing, you know, as a first use case for it. So what's been your experience and how you've been doing things?
So I will be totally clear that everything I've ever published has been written by me. Everything on the blog has been written by me totally, with no AI guidance whatsoever. What I have found really useful is I get often asked, can you write a LinkedIn review for me, or can you write some kind of a recommendation? And to actually like open up the Bedrock console and say, and pick a model and say, here's a bunch of interesting facts about this person. Can you write a really good review about them?
Got it.
Turns out to be something pretty powerful. And then to go through and actually edit it and make sure it's something that you would actually say.
Right.
It still takes some work, but writing those kinds of things is really hard. Like putting in just the right level of, you know, description of these people and making sure that it comes across nicely and that it accurately reflects them and your thoughts about them. I find that AI is actually quite helpful for that.
Okay. And how do you see so you said you write all of your blog posts and all of that stuff. Does AI assist? I mean, you've got tons of experience doing this. So, you know, I actually think that at a certain skill level, the AI is never going to match it. But for things that you are not quite at that skill level, like for someone who is not great at writing, or someone who gets really stuck at getting started with some writing, AI seems to be useful at least giving you a leg up in getting started.
I totally agree
with a lot of that
now,
stuff.
one thing that is, no matter how much content you've written, that point when you have to start something new and all you have is the blank screen, it's still really scary. You can find almost anything to do besides writing that first sentence. Like it's time to take out the garbage, it's time to go check the garden, it's time to make sure there's filament in the printer, it's time to reorganize some shelf that is not ever used. There's any number of distractions that you can find before you actually have to put that first sentence in there, because that white empty screen is like,
It's scary.
where are all these words supposed to come from? And But then once you get a sentence or a paragraph, it's a little bit easier. If AI can get you from nothing to something, I think that's a huge step forward. Now, there's this interesting challenge for me. Like I've watched what Stephen has done, for example. It's so helpful to him when he's writing code and he's getting all this great productivity and he's getting all this cool stuff. What if you actually like doing it manually? Like there's still actually like a lot of joy in just figuring stuff out for yourself and doing it. And like the AI is awesome, but if it's taking away all the fun, it's like why would I want to actually not write code if I really enjoy writing code?
We were having a discussion with some other folks a few days ago, and part of what I like in programming is, you know, when you're solving the problem, you're figuring out the data structures, you're figuring out the class hierarchy and all the functions, and then there is a really nice moment where you're just kind of implementing it. You've already you're not thinking about the problem anymore, and I find that very relaxing. But that's the part that's the easiest to just automate, right? If you say, okay, I have this set of classes, so then It is true that that kind of serenity of that particular moment goes away if you let it.
Yeah.
But it's hard because you could also just get it done right there.
Yeah, but it's kind of surrounding because you are doing something actually routine. Yeah, like parts of that are like actually really enjoyable to do, and
Yeah. So for me, typically when it comes to coding and stuff like that, I really enjoy the problem solving part of it. So I separate out the semantic and the syntactic part of it. The syntax for me feels not so interesting because it's just the nuance of the language. But the semantics of how something works, or how you're going to put all these pieces together, and how are you going to get it to work, that's definitely exciting. And so for me, AI doing all the syntax part of it makes total sense. So when I write code these days, I typically just write out, here's how I'm going to break it all down. I write comments, like English comments.
Yeah.
And I like, this is what I want to do here. Here's a function I wanted to create to do this. Then a function that does this. Here's how everything will tie in together. And then I let the auto-generator then generate the code for that semantics that I have created, or the structure that I have created. I don't let it do all the, all the semantics part of it, because
right.
I don't feel like it's there yet with all the context. Like, I think as humans, we are terrible at articulating all the context to an AI to say, this is everything that I want. And it doesn't have a context window large enough to encompass everything. But in smaller contexts, I think if you can lay out exactly what you needed to do, and then it's just a question of syntax, it does a far better job of, rather than me doing it myself, because I'm terrible at it. Like if I had to go look up a language today, and I haven't written that much code over the last 7-8 years as I would like. I still write code, but not as much as I would. So I'm not as fluent with all the nitty-gritty syntaxes. Like when Python went from 3.9 to 3.10 to 11 and now to 12, some of the syntaxes have changed a lot, right? About how you define a function, how you do some of the stuff. And I learned by looking at the AI generated for me, rather than, me looking up a book and saying, oh, why is this throwing up this error in the...
Yeah, plus programming is different than when I learned. Like when I learned, there was this like really bounded set of things you need to know to program in some environment. Okay, you're programming in assembly language. Okay, here's the registers, and here's the instructions, and here's the address modes.
Yes.
You need to actually know all of those. Once you know all of those, that is your entire vocabulary that you can use to express what you want done.
Correct.
And then you move up to C, and you've got C, and you've got the standard library and all those kind of things.
Right.
So standard IO and all the various includes.
Right.
You pretty much, there's a couple dozen of them, and you know them.
Yeah.
And again, you pretty much need to commit most of those to memory to write a good C program.
Correct.
But with any API now, with an EC2 API, like if you print out the entire EC2 reference manual, it's probably 1,000+ pages of functions. You don't need to know all of them. It'd be crazy to memorize all the functions and all the data structures.
Yeah.
So a lot of programming is actually looking up versus
I agree.
pulling from memory.
Yeah.
Which should be a really good thing for AI to be able to do for you.
Correct.
Well, and also knowing what's current too.
Correct.
Like I did, I was making a Python one, and I said use a modern argument parsing library. Don't use opparse, use argparse, right?
Yeah.
Just as a simple one, right? I just knowing that detail, that if it uses opparse, well, that's kind of old. I'd rather use argparse.
I still don't understand, how does the model, when you give it these directions, how does it does it go through all of the things you asked and check off and say, okay, I didn't do this, or is that just inherent in all the math that happens there? I've never understood that part of it.
I think you can guide it. You can definitely guide it in the way it goes about predicting what's going to happen next. So you can give it a lot of guidance in terms of what you want it and not want it to do, and the path that you wanted to take.
But some of these prompts seem so elaborate that are people overestimating the ability of the AI to really understand what the prompt is saying? Or
so there's a lot of work that's being done in optimizing what happens with the context window. So in the early days of the context window, finally, you would give it a large prompt and it would only take the first, 2 sentences on the top and the last 2 sentences. Everything in the middle would just be complete garbage. Like, it doesn't matter what you put in there, and all it would look at was the first 2 sentences and the last 2 sentences. That was what was guiding it. But with the more recent iterations of the models that I'm seeing, it actually takes care of all the nitty-gritty details of what you've got inside. But again, the more structured you make it, the more, the better you organize all that information, the better the LLM does with following it. If you give it just huge big lump of paragraph of 5,000 words, I think it'll do a terrible job of it.
I've probably got some really old AI books somewhere around, maybe not up on that shelf, but somewhere. And so much of early AI was about understanding somehow, right? We're going to take natural language and we're going to understand it, and we're somehow going to build these knowledge representations in some really deep, sophisticated way, which apparently are not the way things work anymore. Now it's all of this just math, and it's just linear algebra that we all thought was this boring thing, and maybe we can do cool 3D graphics with it, but it's it's actually just linear algebra on gigantic matrices.
Correct.
Not just, I don't want to say just, because there's clearly a lot of intellectual input, but ultimately there's a bunch of matrix multiplication happening inside there.
Correct. It's gotten pretty sophisticated, and some of it is even hard to understand and grasp as to how it's all working under the hood. But if I look at some of the modern ones, like if I look at Claude 3 in particular, I look at Llama 3 that's now available, the kind of output it's able to produce is absolutely fascinating.
Oh, it's mind-blowing.
It's absolutely mind-blowing as to the kind of tasks it's able to perform, the kind of analysis it's able to do. Like just looking at your screen and giving you instructions about what you should do on your screen is fascinating. Like for me, those kind of, and there are tricks to get it to be even better. For example, one of the problems that we were trying to solve was to really understand everything that's on your screen. It's really hard to say, hey, look at the top left corner, because the LLMs don't understand the concept of a top left corner or a top right corner or whatever. So one of the approaches we decided to do was we took any image you have and we overlay it with a grid. So you literally just overlay that image with a grid, and you give it to the LLM and you say, in grid section, A4 or A5, do you spot this thing?
Okay.
So you can get that sense of, the top right, give it a bit of hint, give it a little more tools to go do something more.
Are you actually making captures again? Like click all the boxes with traffic lights?
No, this is not for capture. This is actually to really understand. We're using a lot of this AI in learning, in students being focused in what they're doing and trying to kind of teach them stuff. But at the same time, when students are not being focused, how do you teach them to be focused at that time? So if you've got multiple different applications running on your screen, if you've got multiple, how do you just identify what is your in-focus application, right? Historically, the way you would solve the problem is you would have an agent that's running on your desktop that would literally be looking at every window that's being open, and you'll find the active window and do it. Now, across different versions of Windows, different versions of Macs, different versions of Linux, that's really hard to do. And that problem is 100x more difficult to solve than letting an AI just look at the screen and say, oh, this is Windows. I don't care which version of Windows you're running or which patch you're running. It's Windows. And now that this is Windows, this seems like your active window versus something else being your active window. And hey, you're solving this problem, like you've got your Prusa slicer up, and maybe you got this setting wrong in the Prusa slicer. It's fascinating what it can, the kind of dimensions it opens up without having to worry about the 100 different operating systems that you have to cater your tool to.
Sure.
And so it's a fascinating new way of doing things. Removes a lot of, I think, one of the things that we do on the live stream is we talk about complexifies and simplifies, right? And give it a cloud. For me, in a lot of different dimensions, it actually simplifies the way you would actually build something out. The complexity in building out a true, universal application today is so high that this feels like one of those technologies that can kind of break the back of some of the approaches you take to solving the problem.
Yeah, I have to say I'm still a little apprehensive about doing live demos of anything AI powered, because there's still this, you even with the models where you have to start with the seed, like when you're doing image generation, for example, and you put in the seed, you have to prep your audience and say, okay, we're doing this, and there's these, I don't want to say hidden variables because I think that means something I don't understand, but there's things behind the scenes that are affecting the output. You're not always quite sure that they're there, and you could practice your demo the day before and the morning of, and you're getting to the audience, and something different could come out, and you have to actually if you're a live demo person, which is a really fun kind of tightrope walking thing to do anyway, you have to actually make sure and say, okay, I've tried this before, and we're going to get the best result now versus the best result from this morning.
Yeah, I think this
might get worse too.
Yeah, it could make it. But here's the thing that I've learned with the AI stuff, which is our brains are now so used to deterministic outcomes that we struggle to kind of deal with, something like AI where things are not going to be very deterministic. But where I found this to work really well, so yeah, even I probably will not do a live demo with AI, but I found it really neat to come up with, to spend the time to articulate what I want as an outcome, take that as my first measure, then write a prompt to try and reach that outcome, but then iterate. Like write an agent, which might be an AI agent that says, tell me everything that's wrong, why I have not reached this. Refine the prompt. Go at it again and iterate to get to the final outcome.
Yeah.
And for a lot of things, for example, if you're generating an image that you want, I might not have the patience to do this again and again, but the machine has enough patience, so I can just run it in a loop.
And I actually find image generation is one of the most fun things to do.
Yeah.
The subtlety with which you can make your requests. I've actually spent some good quality time with the Amazon Titan image generator.
Right.
And it's got some pretty cool stuff in there that you can start pretty simple and get something really helpful quickly, but then you can refine it.
The same thing actually applies to also text and code. Like when code is one of we'll just talk about this, but the code is also one of those really amazing things where you want a certain outcome and your current code that it generates does, or the bug fix doesn't really do it, but if you have a test case to do it, you can test it. The outcome of those tests can go feedback into the loop and can fix it, iteratively till you get the outcome that you really want.
Well, that's like the DSPy approach, where it's saying, instead of saying...
So are we on again?
Yeah, we're back on.
Okay.
So with DSPy, you can basically say, here's the outcome I want, iterate automatically on the prompt to maximize your probability of getting that outcome. And Ethan Mollick made a really neat point. He said that programmers are actually horrible at using AIs compared to teachers, because teachers are used to dealing with non-deterministic, stubborn, perhaps not entirely willing learners, and giving them clear enough instructions in order to make something happen. Whereas programmers are just like, we're so focused on a list of an algorithm, and it doesn't. Teachers could be better prompt engineers.
Yeah,
I can see that. I still remember years ago being all set to do a demo of some new AWS service, and I'd practiced and everything, and I was going to use the console. Everything was great the night before. Get up there in front of the audience, open up the console, and it's like, wow, they just deployed a new console. This is going to be fun. Let's go work through this all together. And I just, every time I think about let's get up in front of an audience and show them something AI powered, I realize, okay, this is that same experience where you have to make sure that there's things behind the scenes that are going to affect the output, and you need to be prepared for that, and you need to prep the audience. Okay, the models have probably been updated or retrained since I last tested. There might be different models coming into play. Some of the more sophisticated apps and tools will actually say, okay, let's use one model to plan our approach, and we're going to actually deploy others to actually get the answers we want.
Yeah.
Any one of those is going to get improved over time.
Correct.
But it says that you don't get these nice functions effectively where you put in a set of inputs and you get the same output every time.
Agreed. And I think things are also evolving in the sense that it gets a little more complex in the sense that when you have a large task that you're trying to perform, nowadays the general pattern seems to be use different models for doing different specific tasks that those models are very good at. And that adds to the complexity of the determinism of what the outcome is going to be, because each one of those has a probabilistic outcome that you're going to get, and then as you aggregate it all.
But we're still like really 2 years into this. I mean, 2 years ago, if we go back to 2 years ago, and you say generative AI,
like,
most people have not heard of it. So at this point, we're 2 years into something that's got several decades of exciting times ahead. So that's all right.
Agree. No, it's definitely a very interesting and fascinating thing. Last question for you. What is one use case that you get very excited about when you think about AI, but you'd like it to see evolve in a very interesting.
The funny thing is, for years and years before we even were at the generative AI, I was already thinking ahead to my final blog post, and I've already actually got an end date for my final blog post, and I was hoping that final blog post, it would show up, and at the end it would, by the way, say, P.S. this was written by a computer, not by Jeff.
Okay.
And I kind of thought that was just like my imagination speaking, but now the date's actually approaching, and I think this idea that we could say, okay, write a blog post in Jeff's style as the farewell to 20 years of blogging could actually happen, and it would be like, I've replaced myself.
And with a
Kinda cool.
completely AWS powered stack to do
Exactly,
that, right? You could
yeah.
use Bedrock, you could load up all your blog posts into a RAG backed by RDS. You could do a lot
Exactly.
to make that work.
Yeah, I'd actually like to know like what are the most overused phrases I've done over the years and things like that. Would be super fun to have like.
Well, you're probably already in the lexicon of most of these global models. So you could say, write a Jeff Barr style blog post and then on something you wouldn't blog about and see what happens.
Worth trying. But they're actually, the funny thing is I actually do have a wrap-up date for the blog. It's not a retirement date, but I do have a wrap-up date. And so I will, maybe that final post will be AI written.
That would be really fascinating. I don't know whether you saw this, but Reid Hoffman recently did an interview of him interviewing himself with an AI. And that was pretty fascinating. He just fed it all of the books he'd written, all the interviews that he'd ever, done, and all the articles that he'd written, and then got an AI to kind of interview him as part of it.
As long as you actually wrote it yourself, right? If you had a ghostwriter, you could be surprised. Wait, I don't remember saying that.
That's very true. Anyway, thank you so much, Jeff, for having us here, of course.
Totally
And
fun.
this has been absolutely fascinating. I've learned a ton. I'm definitely going to take up the learning on taking the leadership principles and writing it up for your team, because that makes a lot of sense. That
I will
just-
actually
That's a
share
good idea.
my copy. I've
That'd be
presented it
awesome.
in public a bunch of times, and
Great.
I present to audiences all over the world, so I will happily share.
No,
share
that'd
it
be
with you.
awesome. That's something I'm definitely going to go and do again with my team. So thank you
Sounds
again.
good.
Well, we do want to shift gears really quickly before we wrap up into 3D printing.
Oh,
What are you printing? I think not just shifting gears, but I'm going to have to shift the cameras a little bit. So 1 second, and we're going to
Okay.
I'm going to move this camera.
Yeah.
I want to see what you're printing.
Yeah. All right, so this is my Prusa XL printer, and what is really cool about this is that it actually has 5 separate tool heads, and I've got 5 different colors of filament loaded up into the tool heads. And in just a few seconds, it'll probably want to change to the next color. Right now, it is printing from number 4, which is this wood color. And it's going to dock that one. You can see it's going to go back there, and it does this very satisfying motion back there. It clicks and releases, and it's going back, and now it's actually picking up some of the orange from extruder number 1. It does a quick pass over that little tower to make sure that the print head is clean. And then it prints the next layer of orange, and it's absolutely fascinating and hypnotic to watch as it goes about its business there. This one's leaving a little bit of fuzz. I'm not quite sure which filament is leaving the fuzz.
Stealth mode is still on, so it's actually running slow.
Yeah, this is we could turn stealth mode off and speed it up just a little bit right there. We turn stealth mode. So stealth mode makes it quieter and a bit slower. You can hear it there as it's moving faster.
The build volume is pretty amazing. So this one has almost, what are the dimensions of this
It's
one?
360 by 360. I don't remember the Z dimension, but that's the Z dimension right about there.
That is more than 360.
Yeah.
It's probably 400
Yeah.
plus. That's
Yeah,
amazing.
so I've printed some pretty tall things. I think the tallest thing I printed was about 29 hours of printing and several thousand changes.
Wow.
So that mechanism has been really reliable so far.
That's pretty neat.
Yeah.
A traditional, like a Mark IV, you'd basically get a 210 by 210 by 200 or so.
Yeah, and officially 200. I've seen people push it a tiny bit on the edges to do some magic.
Oh, that's fascinating. And you can do all this multicolored stuff.
Yeah. Now, when people ask me the difference between the single extruder and the multi-extruder, with the single extruder, you're basically making a sandwich because it's layer by layer by layer, and you can do multicolor by basically switching colors between the layers. And I've done quite a bit of that. So like when I do my fabric printing, that's like a sandwich because it's some printing, some fabric, and then some more printing.
Right.
But with the 5 extruder, it's more like making a salad because you can mix up all the colors within a layer. And so something as complex as this, I'm not sure where our camera is, something as complex as this, which is hundreds and hundreds of squares, each with a random color and a random height.
Does it optimize? What does it optimize on? Does it optimize on a color or one filament at a time?
It's always going layer by layer, and so from what I can tell, it will do.
Like if there are 4 colors in one layer, will it finish all the items for one color?
Yes, it will.
And then the second, and then the third, and the fourth?
It sure seems to work like that.
Okay.
It's hard to tell, but I think if it didn't, it would take forever to do that. So, because when you print something like this, it'll skip all over the place. And it's just doing all the red, then the purple, then the white, and the gold for that layer before stepping up to the next one. Yeah, so this is of no value other than to show that I know how to generate these kind of things. I did come up with a really cool way to use OpenSCAD to generate multi-extruder files. Because the one interesting aspect of all of this right now is that the design tools are kind of behind the capabilities of the printer. There's a few design tools that you can design in multiple colors, but the STL file format doesn't, it's way predates 3D printing, so it doesn't actually have color representation. So what with using OpenSCAD, I came up with this way to render the same image 5 times in a row, once for each extruder, and then you load all those up into the slicer, and then the slicer's actually pretty smart, and if you load 5 files at once, it will just assign them to toolheads 1 through 5, with no manual work whatsoever.
Ah, okay. So basically, something like this, you would actually print out 5 objects.
That's effectively what I did for this. This is really 5 objects that happen to fit together like a nice puzzle piece.
Okay.
Now,
it's like impossible to take apart puzzle piece, right? They're all
they're
interlocked.
The interesting thing when I was writing the OpenSCAD code is that because they're all generated at random, I had to have the OpenSCAD has a perfect good random number generator, but you can't set the seed once and have it generate a stream of numbers based on that seed. You can explicitly call the generator with a seed. But so the only way to get a reproducible stream was to generate all the numbers once. And then pull from that one pool in a defined order, because I need to actually rerun that whole generation process 5 times. And the funny thing is I didn't even realize that was an issue until like, wait, these puzzle pieces aren't going to fit together. So this is actually a finished multicolor truck, which you can see how cool that came out.
It's printed in place, so there's all these wheels are just printed in place. And you couldn't do this any other way.
No, it's ridiculously cool how nicely that was. So I pulled up Prusa Slicer, and I painted all the different parts. And Prusa Slicer can either do areas or fills, or it's got this actually kind of clever mode where, because ultimately all of this is triangles, you can set the limit of how much of an angle is between like 2 intersecting triangles, and so that way it will kind of go on flattish surfaces but not turn corners. And so by fine-tuning that and by being very good with the undo, you can figure out how to paint complex things like that.
Sorry, I don't understand.
We should wrap up.
Yeah, so, oh, by the way, I should mention that my OpenSCAD code is all open and on a repository if anybody wants to.
Awesome.
Some tools just find AWS cost savings and make you do all the work. Visualizing cost opportunities is great, but that's not enough. CloudFix, on the other hand, actually delivers those savings for you. And you don't need to worry, because CloudFix uses AWS recommended savings techniques. It fixes, not just finds. It's the easiest way to save money on AWS. It's 100% automatic and risk-free. And the best part of all, it works non-stop. Stop overspending on AWS and click on the link to start saving now.